Recently, Mike Tyson was asked if he understood that he's intimidating. And he reacted with, in his typical way, answering with, listen, I'll tell you a story about what happened earlier today when I was talking to my wife about this upcoming boxing fight. And Mike's going on and on about how this one guy, he won't be able to beat his opponent, he's not good enough, and so on. And she just looks at him and replies very coldly, they didn't think Buster Douglas was going to beat you. And first of all, that's very harsh. And as always, they like to say that behind every great man is a great woman. I like to say that behind every great man is a great woman who doesn't take his bullshit. And I think with Mike, that is definitely the case. But why is that relevant to what we're talking about over here? Mike was undefeated heavyweight champ. Nobody thought that Buster Douglas was going to be able to beat him. And Mike was a dominant fighter, and he had been that for a while already. And the most important aspect about Mike's style was that he was just a ferocious puncher. I mean, he was a knockout artist, and that was the main factor that back in the day everybody was agreeing upon, is that Mike just punched so damn hard that he knocked people out left and right. And he'd always been doing that. From an amateur to throughout his professional career, he just knocked people out at a very high ratio of knockouts. At the same time, James Buster Douglas, he was ranked number 7. We can't say he's a bad fighter, obviously not, but his record was by far not as impressive or as clear cut. So nobody expected him to win that fight. I I didn't look up the bookmaking odds, but I'm pretty sure that Douglas was a massive underdog. The point I want to make is that this idea of Mike's punching power being the main thing about him, which I disagree with completely, because there was so much more that made Mike Tyson one of the best boxers ever. But everybody focused on that. There were other factors in that fight that people weren't aware of. For instance, he was not in great shape. Tyson didn't really train all that hard because he considered that, Douglas was just a guy he could easily beat. And that's what he said afterwards. We know he had relationship problems that were pretty severe. He stopped working with his old trainer, Kevin Rooney, and allegedly, I haven't seen confirmation, but allegedly he went out partying all night the night before the fight, drinking, having fun. Now, very few people knew about these variables, and they were then surprised when the fight ended and Tyson was knocked out on the canvas. So the question then becomes, if they'd known all these variables, would they have been less surprised? And that's the topic of today's episode when we talk about single variables, single factors, and multiple variables. Now back to the fight game. This is the appeal of all sports in general, but in particular, when you look at combat sports, there's always a chance of an upset. An underdog can always end up dethroning a dominant champion, a dominant team. Why? Because there are so many variables that you can't entirely predict an outcome, and pure luck also plays a role. This is where what I want to mention comes in, and that's dynamic systems and systems thinking. And this is going to be a long explanation. I hope you can keep on following me all the way to the end, because it will in the end always, all of it will make sense, but I have to put several things on the table before you see the whole puzzle. Also, as always, there will be a bunch of links towards many of the things that I mentioned. You go to wimsblog.com/132, and you'll find all the links there. So what do I mean with dynamic systems? Well, I'll give you a few examples, things that you know. For instance, an ant colony. An ant colony is an example of a dynamic system. Individual ants are unpredictable in the way they move. There is a system there. We know, but part of why they move the way they do, and where they go and how they go there, and why they follow certain routes. But the behavior of the individual ant is more difficult to predict. That said, it leads to a very complex behavior of the entire ant colony that will have certain certain principles that you might be able to find that will predict more or less the way they move. Another example is the weather. Even at this stage, we cannot predict the weather for more than a few days at a time, maybe a week up front, at best 2 weeks, but then it gets really, really iffy and it's very difficult. And very often, as we all know, and especially me living here in rainy Belgium, the weather report is very often wrong. Why is that so? Well, because there are just so many variables that we can't calculate them exactly. We also don't have the computing power to calculate everything, even if we did know all these variables. But it's too much. That said, there are still things we know about how the weather acts. That is why we are able to make forecasts. But it is still so complex that making a 100% accurate forecast all the time is next to impossible. Right now. Maybe one in the future, but right now we can't. There's also an example of a dynamic system. So what do I mean when I say an emergent dynamic system? Well, an emergent dynamic system refers to a complex system where, for instance, new properties or new behaviors, they come out from the interactions of the parts and that cannot be produced by one single part, one single component. Now, these properties, these behaviors, you cannot attribute them to a single component, but you also can't predict them beforehand. Even if it's a system that you designed, you might just be surprised by the results that you get. The emergent part means that the new behaviors, they happen because of an interaction between all these components and the way that they kind of organize themselves in the system. And the end result of all that is that you get a set of very complex patterns and behaviors sometimes, and you can study them after an event takes place in that system, but you won't be able to completely predict the results before that event. That's the key part. So you have this complex system, many, many variables, many factors that influence how the system behaves. There are patterns, rules, and so on that you might be able to deduce after you see something happening in the event, in the system, sorry. But if you look at that beforehand at the system, you cannot predict, well, this is how it's going to go. How is this relevant to martial arts, self-defense, and other things? A few years ago, I actually wrote this a long time ago for my old newsletter many years ago. But then I wrote, about 2 years ago, I wrote an article about this on my blog. And it's a realization that I had that violence is an emergent dynamic system. And the link is in the show notes, like I said. So how can you view this? Well, let's say there's something, you're also in the street and you see this conflict is brewing and you know that it looks like it's going to get violent. Now, even though you can look at both people involved, let's say it's two guys, getting into it in the street, you can look at both guys. You can make an assessment. This guy is bigger than the other one. This one looks a little bit stronger. This one is not paying attention. This one's standing too close. This one is going into a bladed stand. This one is looks like he's gearing up for a big haymaker and so on. You can look at all those factors if you have a lot of experience, but you still cannot predict with 100% accuracy how it's going to play out and who's going to be left standing at the end if it's all said and done. Now afterwards, let's say you film that, the whole discussion that gets heated, the fight itself, and then how it ends. Let's say you have that on video. Afterwards, you can analyze, and then you can say like, okay, this is why that guy missed his punch and the other guy didn't, he connected. And when that guy lost his balance and he fell over, well, that's when he got kicked in the face by the guy who remained on his feet. And this is why the fight ended with that guy who fell over getting knocked out. Afterwards, when it's over, you can look at the dynamics that are involved. You can extract those from the situation. And if you do enough analysis of events like that, you might be able to discover a bunch of principles that keep coming back. a set of dynamics that you can call principles, or maybe even laws that you develop. This is always present. And this, in turn, then, that can give you a framework, like a lens through which you're going to see violence. And then hopefully you use that framework to prepare yourself for, should violence come your way. Here's the thing, though. Even if you have a very solid framework that you develop, you still can't predict what's going to happen when you're faced with a potentially violent situation. And you cannot guarantee an outcome either, because again, there's too many variables to predict, and they all interact with each other. That said, with a little bit of luck, you'll be able to navigate the chaos a bit better than somebody who has no understanding at all. And that is why for many, many years, I've been making my violence analysis videos over on my Patreon, so that my patrons and I myself can learn from real life examples that are caught on video. And then we try to extract the lessons that we can learn, apply them in our own training, and keep ourselves safe. Now, the idea of a complex dynamic system that is unpredictable, that can be applied to more than just self-defense or combat sports. Because the same is true in boxing, kickboxing, mixed martial arts, and so on. Like I said, nobody was expecting Douglas to beat Tyson, to knock him out. But there are so many variables that is also always a possibility. You don't expect that. More likely than not, it's not going to happen, but then it does. And this idea of having complex dynamic systems that you cannot predict what's going to happen, or you cannot attribute value to one specific variable, one factor, and say this is the one that is going to drive everything else. You can't do that in those dynamic systems, because that's not how they function. And this is the crux, the whole point that I want to make with this episode, is that if you can apply this to your everyday life, whether it's in relationships, work, politics, doesn't matter, you can handle a lot of problems much better. You have in my opinion, a much better way of grasping reality than if you don't. There's a problem though, and it is thinking in multiple variables and taking into account a lot of factors into one equation before you make a decision, or you how you view your opinions, how you have opinions on certain things. Being able to do that, that's the primary condition for this to work. Now, as human beings, all too often we just focus on just one factor. We want easy answers, and sadly, in the real world, that's just not how things work. There are many reasons why we do that, but I'd like to focus on two. And the background to that is that as human beings, we are able to think rationally, but just as much, we are very emotional creatures as well. And that manifests in a bunch of ways. And I'll just give you two. First one is logical fallacies. Now, these fallacies are ways in which that we reason incorrectly. It's in which the reasoning that we use, it's not logical, it's flawed. It doesn't make sense. The problem is that we're all at risk of falling prey to these fallacies, as, once again, we're not just rational beings, we're also emotional beings. We still don't fully understand how our brains work. But we do know that it's very complicated. But in short, we're not computers. We're not a calculator. You don't just put in variables and then use the equation and say, like, this is it, with no emotion. It's just not how human beings work. So in the show notes of this page, I have a link to a bunch of these fallacies. There's a lot of them. I'll just give you a few just to illustrate. And the first one is like, two wrongs make a right. Somebody steals something from a store, they get caught, and they defend themselves with saying like, yeah, well, I saw this other guy steal the exact same thing, and he got away with it. Yeah, he was wrong also. When somebody else does something wrong, doesn't mean that you doing it means that it's right. A very common fallacy that you hear children give as an answer when they get caught with their hand in a cookie jar, so to speak. Another one, speaking of children, is the fallacy of appeal to emotion. Instead of giving logical, sound, common sense arguments, what do they say? Well, think of the children. Think of the children. It's like, yes, but that has no relevance to the answer at stake here in the whole problem that we're facing. Yes, we think of the children, but being emotional about this, it's not going to lead us to a solution. Just saying like the stakes are very high because this is going to affect the children, that doesn't, it's not an argument. It doesn't add anything. It doesn't offer any solution. It doesn't bring you closer to a solution either. The only thing it does is make you emotional. One we see all too often, the logical fallacy of ad hominem, which means you play the person, not the ball, so to speak. For instance, this is typical when people have no valid arguments anymore and they resort to attacking the person or the character as something like, well, you know, that guy, I saw you talking to him, but I saw what he said. He's wrong because, you know, last week I saw him kick a puppy. Okay, so that guy may be an asshole. That doesn't mean if he's wrong, that he's wrong in this case. If he's telling you like, look, you know, when you look up the sky's blue, the fact that he kicked the puppy last week makes him an asshole, but it doesn't mean he's wrong that the sky is blue. So all these fallacies that I just mentioned, there's just only three. There's so many more, and there's just you know, biases. There's a long list of ways in which we as human beings don't reason, don't think well, and we think we're doing great. We think we're reasoning logically and rationally, but we're not at all. This long list where all of us, you, me, everybody else, the smartest person you know, the stupidest person you know, anybody in between, we're all susceptible to making these to making these mistakes and using these fallacies, and they make no sense. It takes very consistent and also a lifelong effort to counter our human natural instincts to basically spout this nonsense. Even if we feel that we're completely in the right, and especially when we're emotionally invested in a specific topic, that's when we're most at risk. So this is the way I see it, and in my experience, one of the main reasons why people cannot think in multiple variables and in dynamic systems, because they're too focused on, for emotional reasons, for other reasons, and so on, of just poor thinking, erroneous thinking, not making logical sense, not making good sense, not reasoning well. The second thing that is also a big factor in why it's difficult is dogmatism. Now we live in polarized times. I mean, you've noticed this. Everything's political. Everybody has long toes. Everybody's easily offended, and something you said or wrote maybe 15 years ago gets you in trouble. You get attacked online. Your reputation is trashed. You get fired from your job when they start contacting your boss, your company. Your business gets destroyed, and so on. Cancel culture is real. It's been going on for quite a few years. And along with that came wokeness, this kind of extreme political correctness and basically postmodernism as a whole. All that has infected pretty much every aspect of Western societies. I've talked about this on the podcast and on my social media for a very long time. I'm not going to rehash it. But the result of that is a huge increase in tribalism. And along with tribalism came dogmatism. Now, to give some definitions, dogmatism means that you're expressing your beliefs, your opinions, as if they are facts. Even when they're wrong, you still stick to them. And most of all, you're not open to evidence to the contrary. When you are shown evidence, you still don't accept it. That is dogmatism. The problem with dogmatism is that, again, the world doesn't work that way. The world is much more shades of gray than it is black and white. And if your thinking is dogmatic, eventually you're going to run into the limits of your beliefs and you will be confronted with contradictions. And what typically happens then, again, in combination with these logical fallacies that I mentioned, instead of adjusting your beliefs, what do people do? They instinctively, they double down, and the logical fallacies take over, and they end up, well, you're an asshole, so you're wrong. That's how typically these kind of conversations or discussions tend to end then, with somebody doesn't want to play anymore because they are confronted with the contradiction within their belief system, and the dogmatism fails. I'll give you a few examples, and one is going to be related to martial arts and self-defense and so on, and the other one is going to get political. So hold on to your hats. First one, so 1988, Rick Rufus fights who was a PKA-style kickboxer. So that's no kickboxing, but no leg kicks, all kicks above the waist. And he fought Changpak Gyatsontith. So that was a Muay Thai fighter, and they fought in modified rules. So Changpak was not allowed to use elbows and knees, and I don't think clinching was allowed either, but he could use leg kicks. Rick Rufus, agreed to do the leg kicks, but clearly he had no experience with them. He was, if I'm not mistaken, already world champion then, and he was a good fighter. It's not an issue, but no experience leg kicks. What happened is that it was a long fight, and the Thai fighter just basically threw one leg kick after the other, and Rufus got messed up. I mean, really, really bad. The fight ended with Rufus his legs had turned into noodles, and he just was kicked and swept to the ground, and he couldn't get up anymore. I mean, he fought really bravely. He took a lot of punishment, but he couldn't keep it going, and eventually, he lost the fight. Everybody got upset. If I'm not mistaken, there were riots after the fight and so on. But the interesting part is this. So his brother, who was also a martial artist and later became a guy who actually competed with leg kicks, and he's an excellent MMA trainer now. Jeff, his younger brother, after the fight was interviewed, and he was very dismissive of the leg kicks. And he says, yeah, it doesn't take much talent to kick the legs. Spinning kicks and jump kicks and so on is much, much more difficult and so on. So this attitude of, it doesn't, leg kicks are kind of bullshit. It's a nonsense technique and blah, blah, blah. And our style is so much better. Despite the fact that he just saw his brother, the world champion, get completely obliterated by leg kicks. He got emotional, he got upset, and he used the logical fallacy. It doesn't take too much talent to do leg kicks, which is completely wrong. Which again, he changed his mind later. Jeff has talked about this, and clearly because he competed and teaches leg kicks, so he definitely changed his mind. But at that moment, he was unable to accept that. He was very young also, but you can see that he was stuck in that dogmatism for emotional reasons. Just saw his brother get beat up. The same thing happened when other fighters who were also doing like Rick Rufus, the kind of PKA kickboxing, so no leg kicks, they came to Europe and fought European kickboxers who had added leg kicks to the game. I've given this example many times. That was pretty much the only main difference between the PKA style kickboxing and the European kickboxing was that leg kicks were allowed. Like you add one technique. Back in the day, I would buy the VHS videotapes of these events. I would read the magazines and so on. And I remember, American champions in PKA style saying like, well, leg kick is kind of overrated, and we'll just side kick over the leg kick with our lead leg, so they won't be able to touch us. That was the mindset of many PKA style champions and good fighters, great fighters. But what happened? They came over here. They fought guys who used leg kicks, and they got their legs chopped off. They got beat up. Side kicking over that leg kick was not working. One technique different changed the entire game. Dynamic system, that is the sport of kickboxing. All the different variables that exist, jab, cross, hooks, uppercuts, push kick, side kick, spinning back kick, body kick, high kick, all these different variables that you have in the game started interacting differently when you added one more technique, the leg kick. And some fighters learned and adjusted. Others never competed with leg kicks again. The same thing happened about 30 years ago when the UFC got started. When all of a sudden, good fighters discovered that when you fought the Gracies, if you didn't have an excellent ground game, you lost. You could punch and kick them, it's fine. They had no problems with that. They just took you to the ground and choked you out, or made you, put you in a lock, an armbar or whatever, and then you had to give up. You had to tap out. Again, add new variables, more is allowed. And all of a sudden, everything changes because it's a dynamic system. You have to take into account all the variables. Now, back in those days, some fighters stopped trying to compete in the UFC and in MMA style tournaments. Others adjusted. They learned grappling. They learned groundwork. They learned stuffing takedowns and so on. They adjusted. And nowadays, in MMA circles, hardly anybody would say like, well, you don't need to learn how to find the ground. Grappling is overrated. Nobody would say that because they adjusted to the reality that always existed, but only was shown once people who came from kickboxing, Muay Thai, and so on entered a competitive format in which more was allowed. And then all the other factors that they already knew how to handle, the interactions were different, everything changed, and there were new rules, new dynamics to discover and learn. The same thing applies to politics. Some people might get upset at this. I don't mean to upset anybody, but we're going to get a little bit political. When we talk about the war in Ukraine, the war between Israel and the Palestinians, I see a lot of people online talk about this all the time. The war in Ukraine has been going on for a little bit over a year and a half. People are still going at it and talking about who is right, who is wrong. But most of all, why do they do what they do? Why they do it that way, and so on. What happened? What happened first? What happened afterwards? And who's at fault? All this kind of discussions. The issue that I see is that people get dogmatic and they get emotional and they cherry pick their arguments on a timeline. For instance, somebody says something and then the other person in discussion days talks, oh yeah, well, a year before that, those guys did that. And then this goes over and back between both parties, and eventually they get to a cutoff date where one person says like, yeah, that's nonsense, that's too long ago, that doesn't make sense anymore. Okay, my response is then, why that date? Why suddenly do you not want to go back in time to look at what might be causing what's happening today? Why is there a cutoff date? Now, before we go on, either there is a cutoff date or there isn't. It's binary. There's no two choices. Either you say, well, I accept that at a certain point in time, we go too far back into the past to look for reasons why things happen today. And there are so many variables that, that doesn't make sense to attribute value to that variable. Or you say, well, okay, I accept that there's a cutoff date. If there isn't, you can keep going with the discussion, going back in time. But if there is, how do you decide where that cutoff date is? Where do you place it? For example, there's a lot of talk for years now about reparations to people. Okay, where I live, the people here, I'll call them my people, we've been persecuted and oppressed for a very long time by the Dutch, the French, the Germans, the Spanish, the Austrians, Scandinavians. I can even go back 2,000 years to Julius Caesar, who tried to commit a genocide over here, killing tens of thousands of my people and enslaving many more. So if I were to ask for reparations, how far back in time would be reasonable to go? Again, we get back to the discussion. Is there a cutoff date or not? If there is one, please tell me why you cut off at that specific date in time. Again, I can go back 2,000 years. If you say, no, Wim, that's exaggerated, that's too long ago, it doesn't make sense. Okay, 2000 is too long ago. What is not too long ago? And then we can get back to the Germans and the Dutch and the French and the Spanish and so on, and all the murders and the raping and pillaging that they did here. and oppressing my people. Okay, and again, I say my people because people, other folks listening to this might better understand what I'm talking about. This is not how I view things. I'm not asking for reparations, but where's the cutoff date? I'll give you an example. We did get reparations from the Germans. They gave, after World War II, a small part of Germany became Belgium. So they gave up a part of their land as a compensation for what they did here during the Second World War. So that one's off the table. But we can go back in time. Okay, where's the cutoff date? Now, why do I talk about history like this? All these events, when people get into discussion, well, that side did this and that country did that, and that's why it started. No, 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 no. The year before, the other country did that, blah, blah, blah. All these events, they always happen in a dynamic system, and the dynamic system we're talking about, that's society. There are so many variables in societies that picking just one to focus on, cherry picking the points that will bolster your argument, it's not just incorrect thinking, that is purely dogmatic. You're using whatever you find to help advance your argument, and you're neglecting all the incidents and all the aspects and all the events that will go counter your argument because you want to win, because you're emotionally invested and so on. That's not how history works. I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, we learned about the revolution that ended up creating my country of Belgium. And in short, we learned that there was an opera, The Mute of Portici, and that inspired the people into glorious revolution. That was proposed as the variable, the factor, the main factor that created the revolution that created my country. Right. About a year ago, I wrote a post on Facebook about it, and I wrote it when it came because there was, at that point, there was still a lot of talk about, what are the causes of Russia invading Ukraine, and a lot of people are like, Putin's insane. Okay, so that was like the main factor, again, single variable factor. He's a warmonger who wants to create a new Russian empire, again, one factor. And I was like, okay, this is not how history works. This is not how humanity works. So I shared some information about my country. So you can read it back, but I'll explain it here. A few centuries ago, Europe was very different than it is now. We're talking Europe in the early 1800s. There was war, there was a lot of it, all over the continent, and sometimes it took decades before a war was over. There are many historical reasons for that, but I'm not going to go into those now. Specifically for what I want to talk about, after Napoleon was defeated, the powers that were victorious, as the UK, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, they decided it was time to organize things. So they sat down in Vienna and they're like, okay, we're going to get rid of some regimes, we're going to make a few new ones, we're going to redraw the lines on the maps, and all that obviously in the name of peace, right? Sounds familiar. Now, France was defeated, but they weren't destroyed. So there was a good chance that eventually there would be war again. So maybe it would be better that we create a solution for that problem, right? And one of the ideas was to create a buffer state between France and Prussia, Germany. So they created the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. That territory is what is now the Netherlands and my country, Belgium. And the way it worked, because there was no real war between the big powers for decades. So in that regard, it was successful. Now, as an aside, that gave these, other powers the incentive to go off and colonize Africa and Asia instead of fighting back home. And, I digress, but there are always unintended consequences, and these are rarely taken into account. Now, here's the thing. The new created country of Belgium had a lot of problems from the start. There was unemployment, there was religious tensions, political underrepresentation, and so on. And all that was obviously to be expected because the local people, the people living here, they were not giving a choice. People were just presented with like, okay, you are now being ruled by that guy in the north, the king of the north for the Game of Thrones fans. He's your ruler now. Okay, accept it, deal with it, and he's very authoritarian. So shut up if you know what's good for you. All these problems, they festered for about 15 years, and eventually there was an opera that was performed in Brussels, The Mute of Portici, in 1830. And wouldn't you know, that was so inspirational that the locals just took the streets and they started rioting, and there was this glorious revolution, and it just sprung to life. Right? This is how I learned it in history class in high school. Now, what they didn't teach was things like, for instance, the the brave children of that revolution. They did fun activities like torching houses and businesses, looting, pillaging, raping, fighting in the streets, and killing a few people left and right, but stuff like that. Organized revolution. I thought it was spontaneous. Well, organized by maybe different factions, secret groups, politicians. France, who's the neighbor, who maybe wasn't very happy with the situation. No, that's fake news. Disinformation, lies, right? It was completely spontaneous. Right. So in the show notes, I'll give you the Wikipedia link to Alexandre Gondebien. And it's just one guy. There's many more. There's one guy. Alexandre Gondebien was a lawyer, a revolutionary, and some people they regard him as the father of the Belgian Revolution. He organized gangs to beat up people in the streets and riot, and he later became Minister of Justice, of all things. He was actually a rattachiste, and that means that he wanted Belgium to go back to France. He did not start the revolution because he wanted to liberate the Belgian people. He started one because he was not happy with what the big powers had decided after Napoleon's defeat to make this one country as a buffer state. He wanted, no, we need to go back to France. He was indeed instrumental in the revolution, but we're now almost 200 years later, and it still hasn't happened. We still haven't gone back to France, and I think that France wouldn't really welcome us either if we asked to take us up into the French countryside, basically. Now, the reason I mention all this is that revolutionaries, they have motivations and agendas that sometimes only show up many, many, many years later. And also, if you look deeper into the history, as opposed to just glancing over it on a Wikipedia page, or what you hear in school, or what somebody who also has an agenda is telling you about that, right? But okay, moving on. but before we move on, when you hear reports of a more recent revolution, the Arab Spring, the revolution in Maidan in Ukraine, and so on, maybe think about what is accurate, what is being portrayed there, what you're being told about it in the news, and so on. Spontaneous, right? It just pops up out of nowhere, right? Just like the Belgian Revolution, right? And I'm skipping so much about the Belgian Revolution, how it was orchestrated. And again, this is now historical record. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is historical record. You can look it up yourself. Anyway, moving on. So our glorious Belgian Revolution had problems at the beginning, making progress, but eventually it succeeded. Now, that was a big mess for the powers that be, because that kind of messed up what they decided in Vienna, and there was the risk of Europe exploding into war again. So they sat down once again. I'm like, okay, we're gonna handle it this way. We're gonna tell the Dutch like they have to shut the hell up. We're gonna invite those goddamn French to sit at the table too this time, even though they were defeated. But let's get them at the table. We're gonna take a German prince. We're gonna marry him to a French princess. We're gonna make him king of Belgium, and that's gonna be our new buffer state. And that's what happened. So this is the origin of my country. It's oversimplified. I'm skipping gigantic parts, and I'm not including anything that came beforehand. So I'm using a cutoff date. The result of all this is a dysfunctional country that has built-in ethnic conflicts and a structure of government you can only describe as a failed state. During the pandemic, just as an illustration, during the pandemic, for a country of about 11 million people, we had 8 different ministers of health, and none of them functioned correctly. If you want more, look into the state structure of Belgium, and you won't be able to make sense of it. Even we sometimes can't. Now, all that, it's been falling apart for decades. It's slowly, Belgium is breaking up. Why? Because almost 200 years ago, for many, many, many variables that we will never fully comprehend because there's too many of them and not all of them are documented, a bunch of people decided that we're going to make a country. And it has been slowly falling apart for 200 years. But it did succeed in one of its goals, and that is that for the longest time, there was no more war between the great powers. So why do I give you this history lesson? Well, there's similar stories like this all over the world throughout history. What is happening today in Europe and in Israel is no different. There's other players involved, but the game of international politics, what I say is that geopolitics is always played as a full contact game with no rules. That was true 200 years ago, it is true today. So if you think that one side is bad and all bad and the other side is all good, typically the side that you support, you're being deceived. If you think only one side lies and cheats and uses propaganda, you are also being deceived. If you think a conflict on that scale is only happening because one guy is like an evil tyrant and a bad guy and so on, you're naive. The same is true if you think of the good side and you're like, oh, they only do this because they're upstanding principles, they're moral people, and they're doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. You are being duped into supporting them and not asking questions. If you think that politicians and opinion makers and pundits and so on, they care about you or me when they promote war instead of suing for peace, I think you're very much out of touch with not just history, but also human nature. If you think in the past it was different or better, or that it will not be so in the future anymore, that will never happen again, you might as well believe in fairy tales. Because we have thousands of years of human history recorded that says otherwise. Thinking that suddenly this is going to go away is naive at best. Fukuyama, who said, after the Berlin Wall fell, he spoke of the end of history. Like, okay, that's it, history is over. He was completely wrong. He misunderstood human nature and for sure didn't understand history. And I know we can talk more about that, but I won't. But the thing is that the only thing that we can do as common people is try to survive and live our lives best we can, because those in power that want to change the world, they don't ask your opinion. Never. Because they think they know better. And we also don't get a vote in whether we want that glorious revolution or not. Because typically revolutionaries are also always a minority of the people. Again, like I said, it's always been this way, and I have no reason to believe that it's ever going to be different. Now, none of what I just said means that evil doesn't exist. And evil people do exist. And none of it means that you shouldn't do anything. That's not what I'm saying. What it means is that you have to look at conflicts as if they were in an emergent dynamic system. Not look at them like you're a 3-year-old who can only look at one factor and then decide that's it. But you have to look at it as a very complex system with so many interacting components that it's very difficult to understand what causes what. But at the same time, may find that it's difficult to get to solutions for the very same reason. Now, what can you do? Because I've been complaining now for a long time. What can you do? Well, start by accepting that you have to stop thinking in single variables, single factors. The example I give nowadays is that if you're a parent and your 3-year-old says, Mom or Dad, I'm hungry, and you ask what do you want to eat, and it says chocolate, and you only think, well, single variable, if I give my child chocolate, my child will not be hungry afterwards. So you give him 2 pounds of chocolates, and the kid eats until he can't anymore. He's not hungry anymore. He's sick in his stomach. He's gonna mess up his health, but he's not hungry anymore, right? Single variable. So kid goes to bed sick, wakes up in the morning, feels better. Mom, I'm hungry. Dad, I'm hungry. What do you want to eat, son? I want to eat some more chocolate. You give it again because the one variable that is being handled is the child hungry afterwards? Yes or no? I give that child chocolate again. The hunger goes away. Done. Keep that up for weeks, months, and if the kid survives years, what do you get? A sick child. That's what you're going to get. So if you look at multiple variables, well, yes, my child is hungry, but I have to do more than that. It has to be, healthy food, and it has to be this, has to be that, and so on. That makes more sense, right? Apply the exact same thing to everything else. Breaking through single variable thinking and immediate consequence thinking, instead of thinking of consequences of second and third order, that is a skill. It's a skill set. It's critical to not just survive on this planet, but also thrive and do well. And systematically doing that is very, very difficult. And it's something that you will have to do your entire life, or always being aware that you are always at risk of logical fallacies and dogmatic thinking, because we're humans, never going to go away. I'm going to leave you with the advice that I saw Lynn Alden, who's an economist that I've been following for a while. Also, she used to be a martial artist, very smart person. I really like her approach, and I'll put a link to her book and her Twitter, because she's very active there, on the show notes. And she wrote this in March of this year, and she says, number one, kill your ego. Number two, kill your ideology, but not your goals. Number three, build a new framework, but an open and flexible one. 4, ask questions and deal with people you agree with and disagree with. Approach disagreement as a way to learn. And she says that hardly anybody does this in any discipline. And I've seen her live by these standards in her public interactions. I have no idea what she is like in private, but I've seen her systematically be like this. Doesn't mean that if somebody comes gunning for her, that she doesn't fire back. Quite on the contrary. People are sometimes amazed that when she does, stop, she takes the gloves off and pushes back on somebody who's being an asshole. They're like, wow, okay, where did that come from? And she's like, she explained this, like, okay, no. You have to defend yourself if they come at you. But this is something very, very different. Get rid of your ego, kill it. Your ideology, you have to change it when you learn new information. Doesn't mean that you have to abandon your goals. And build a new framework, but an open and flexible one. The first time you're proven wrong should be a lifelong lesson. It's like, okay, I was wrong about this. What else am I wrong about? And as you go through life, regularly check that the framework that you have, the beliefs that you have, that they're still valid. You might be surprised all of a sudden that they're not. And asking questions and deal with people you agree and disagree with, and approaching disagreement as a way to learn, is a critical skill. You don't have to agree with somebody to talk to them. There are limits to this, obviously. I don't feel very much interested in striking up a conversation with a serial killer. That the understanding how their psychology works and so on might be interesting, but that's not necessarily somebody that I want to have a big discussion with. So beyond such an extreme, there are more people that you can talk to, the people you disagree with, than you might think. As we live in polarized times, this is something that more and more people have discarded. The idea that you can agree to disagree is something that we, in many parts of society, specifically in public and online, something that has been lost for the most part. I think it's going to make a comeback. See encouraging signs, that the pendulum is starting to swing in the opposite direction. So we'll see how that goes. But being able to do that, I think, is a critical skill. It gets you so much more, and you will end up being more in win-win situations as soon as you start looking for a way to learn, as opposed to I disagree with this person and I want to win. That might get you somewhere, but eventually, again, like with dogma, like with logical fallacies, you're going to run into the limits of that and going to crash into a wall. But the main advice that Lynn gives at the end of this tweet is hardly anybody does this in any discipline. It's extremely rare. And I've talked about this before. One of the main lessons I learned from one of my best friends, Barry Eisler, is when he talked about whenever he is in a situation in which somebody does him wrong or says something that is like, wow, that's a really bad thing or whatever, his second reaction is, okay, do I do anything like that myself? And I think that's a wonderful philosophy. It's a great way to be in life. That and all the other advice that I just gave from Lynn is something we have to accept, that we are human. We will fall short. It's not going to work all the time, but at least try. That's the biggest thing, is know that you're human, understand that we're all going to fail, but do try. I try every day, and I guess I fail more often than I'd like, but it's making progress in that direction. That is the most important part. Well, that's it. Folks, again, all the links in the show notes at winsblog.com/132, so 132. That's the number of this episode. All the stuff will be there. As always, like, share, subscribe, leave some comments. Join me on Patreon. Been going for 5.5 years. There's just hundreds and hundreds of videos and posts that are instructional, and you cannot get them anywhere else because they're only there. All right, that's it. Talk to you guys next time. Bye.